J. Bruce Ismay died on the night of the 14th to the 15th of April 1912 and died again in his bedroom 25 years later. No other quotation I encountered during my research on Bruce Ismay captures so succinctly the fatalism surrounding a figure who looms larger than any other in the Titanic disaster. Ismay undoubtedly survived that night, but his legacy would not. In retrospect, Ismay is often reduced to the caricature of a callous aristocrat, yet this view minimises the uncomfortable truth. He was, above all, a capitalist, embedded in a system dependent on cheap Irish labour to construct assets designed primarily for profit. The Irish socialist revolutionary James Connolly provided a stark assessment of the conditions of Belfast workers at the Holland and Wolff dry docks on behalf of White Star. In these industrial parts of the north of Ireland, the yoke of capitalism lies heavy upon the lives of the people. Our shipyards offer up a daily sacrifice of life and limb on the altar of capitalism. The clang of the ambulance bell is one of the most familiar daily sounds on the streets between our shipyards and our hospitals. It has been computed that some 17 lives were lost on the Titanic before she left the Layton. Lives ruined, fair prospects blighted, homes devastated, crippled wrecks of manhood upon the streets, or widows and orphans to eat the bread of poverty and pauperism. Ironic then that whenever the name Ismay is broached, or indeed any discussion regarding the Titanic, it is seldom from the perspective of the exploited worker. The allegations and indictments regarding Ismay's actions and behaviour are limited mostly to his supposed scheming and cowardice. Cast and accused by filmmaker and layperson alike, he becomes less a man than a figure of guilt, his class distilled into a reductive caricature, allowing systemic inequities to be deflected, simplified, and ultimately reimagined as grand conspiracies. Far often, for the sake of clarity, the themes of the Titanic disaster undergo an abridgment. Why is it that the effect of a sensational catastrophe on a modern nation is not of sympathy with the bereaved, but of a wild defiance of inexorable fate and undeniable fact by an explosion of outrageous romantic lying, wrote George Bernard Shaw in the immediate aftermath? What is the first demand of romance in a shipwreck? It is the cry of women and children first. No male creature is to step into a boat as long as there is a woman or child on the doomed ship. Women and children first. That is the romantic formula. In essence, we see an attempt to simplify complexity via myth and simplistic narratives. This is undeniably the case in the portrayal of Ismay within cinema. He is a figure forever entrapped within popular culture, emblematic of the ship itself and the disaster as a whole. His character is lordly, hubristic, rarely heroic, mostly villainous, and above all, tragic. He is never at the centre of his own story. We watch him skulk around the margins of films like A Night to Remember and James Cameron's Titanic, the image of wealth, weakness, and self-interest, an almost sickly figure separated from the healthy fellowship of potential heroes, an idler amongst workers who gets in everyone's way when he is only trying to help. Those films are two of the more well-known examples of Ismay on the big screen, and arguably a little more sympathetic than most others. Perhaps the most extreme characterizations of Ismay are portrayed in the notorious Nazi-made Titanic, filmed during the Second World War, and the 1996 Titanic miniseries, a low-cost, hurried attempt to preempt Cameron's version. In the Nazi film, the main antagonist of the film is E.F. Feuerbringer's Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, who is so intent on increasing the value of his shares in their company that he sends the liner speeding through Iceberg Alley on a quest to break transatlantic crossing records. Aside from this fascist Anglophobic rendition, in the more recent of the unpleasant depictions, Bruce Ismay, played by Roger Rees, gets one of his less sympathetic on-screen portrayals. We see him going behind the captain's back to ensure the Titanic is going as fast as possible, and later he is seen literally lurking in the shadows before slipping into a lifeboat. At best, Ismay is tacitly responsible for the disaster and generally naive in A Night to Remember and Titanic 97, but the egregious aspects are accentuated more often than not in most portrayals. From these, one can almost see Ismay twisting the corners of his moustache in a generally slimy way, the stereotypical sneaky, nefarious businessman out to make a profit even if it risked lives. From the worst of these, one can envision Ismay up on the captain's shoulders like some enraged baboon, pummeling the commander's head while screaming for him to go faster. Thusly, his legacy is unable to escape such depictions, which are the most accessible references available for the casual observer. Ismay is a manageable scapegoat, less for who he was, but rather for what he represents. In the unfolding record of behaviour, it is the stewardesses and bandsmen and engineers, persons of the trade union class, who shine as brightly as any. And by the supreme artistry of chance, it fell to the lot of that tragic and unhappy gentleman, Mr. Bruce Ismay, to be aboard and to be caught by the urgent vacancy in the boat and the snare of the moment. No untried man dare say that he would have behaved better in his place. He escaped. He thought it natural to escape. His class thinks it was right and proper that he did escape. It is not the man I would criticise, but the manifest absence of any such sense of the supreme dignity of his position as would have sustained him in that crisis. As a member of the aristocratic bourgeoisie, therefore, Ismay had a responsibility to have led by example and perish. To do otherwise would relegate him to those stewards and engineers who did perish, but significantly lack notions of leadership. To elevate the individual above his class, despite the significance of individualism within high society, would only reveal the frightened person who just wanted to live. Such a human action of self-preservation shocked and shamed the elite, and any moral legitimacy they professed to possess. Ismay had a tendency to sign off telegrams with his surname reversed, in a forlorn attempt to provide some anonymity from the public eye even before the disaster. Ismay backwards Yamsey was an inversion of the man Ismay used to be. He stepped into a looking-glass world. Everything is the same, only the things go the other way. He was in this sense a nowhere man, nominally a member of the wealthy English industrial class, but his actions were deemed to be those of Italians, or any other derogatory epithet ascribed to those who tried to save themselves. Ismay the Englishman and visionary, and Yamsey the so-called foreigner and scheming capitalist, the survivor and the coward. William Alden Smith was a self-made man. Born into poverty in 1859, by 1906 he was a senator for Michigan. He was a populist and prone to sum up situations on scant facts. Ismay was born in 1862, and by 1904 he became the president of White Star's owners, the International Mercantile Marine. By contrast, Ismay inherited his father's business and was the first of his family to be educated in a preparatory school, one seen as arrogant and backward-looking, the other as naive and progressive. Smith, just one of Ismay's American adversaries, would not bestow him with the backhanded compliment of super captain. Instead, that would fall to an Irishman during the British inquiry. Smith, however, did preside over the events of the American inquiry into Titanic's sinking, implying a similar line of attack. The American senator's maritime nescience and egotism would in turn be ridiculed by the British press, but he was determined to undermine the monopoly of J.P. Morgan's IMM. Ismay was the initial target, who he was convinced was culpable of something nefarious. During his cross-examination of Ismay, he audaciously suggested that the industrialists had ordered Titanic into an ice field to win a bet. Such an accusation has no basis of proof. However, throughout the last century, a persistent claim is that Ismay at least pressured Captain Smith to accelerate through the perilous ice-ridden waters of the North Atlantic for reasons aside from a wager. On Saturday, April 13th, one day before the Titanic struck the iceberg, first-class passenger Elizabeth Limes claimed to have heard Ismay in discussion with Captain Smith that their voyage to New York was ahead of schedule. The following is Limes' recollection and deposition to the one-way conversation between Ismay and Smith. "Well, we did better today than we did yesterday," said Ismay. "We made a better run today than we did yesterday. We will make a better run tomorrow. Things are working smoothly. The machinery is bearing the test. The boilers are working well. We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday." For anyone who has seen James Cameron's 1997 Titanic, this scene is reenacted as the precursor to the disaster, and the portrayal leaves little doubt, firmly pointing the finger at Ismay for ordering Smith to light all available boilers and run headlong into icy waters and surprise the New York press and receive acclaim. Any real-life exaltations from Ismay, however, should not be confused with any command. Smith, an experienced seaman, would not dare to be overruled on any matter, with all the navigation of his vessel and in earshot of passengers. Furthermore, beating the Olympic did not refer to any record-breaking feats in proving the Titanic's speed, but simply to better the time of her sister from the year previous. This may come across as rather inconsequential in consideration of the reasoning behind any prospective unofficial orders regarding the vessel's pace, be it to race her sister or any other ship. It does, though, provide significant context concerning performance rather than publicity. Ismay did admit to having a conversation with Chief Engineer Joseph Bell in Queenston before the Titanic would leave sight of land forevermore regarding an expectation of speed during the crossing. I then spoke to him about the ship, and I said it is not possible for the ship to arrive in New York on Tuesday. Therefore, there is no object in pushing her at full speed. We will arrive there at 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and it will be a good landing for the passengers in New York, and we shall also be able to economise our coal. We did not want to burn any more coal than we needed. It could be argued that an earlier arrival in New York would not have increased publicity for the Titanic, or for practical purposes been any advantage for those on board. A late night arrival on Tuesday would have been largely absent from view to the majority of New Yorkers, and given the press considerably less time to file the reports for the morning papers. This in itself is not credible evidence to prove innocence, however, but it is worth remembering that the fanfare around the Titanic's voyage has been magnified in the years since. In reality, much of the attention had instead been focused on the Olympic's maiden voyage the year previous. The Olympic had vastly outclassed the former largest ship by 15,000 tons when launched, whilst the Titanic was an improvement in such regard by a mere 1,000 over a sister. Bigger, but not by much. The notion which comes to mind is the Apollo 13 mission, which only came to public attention when disaster struck, as audiences were quickly desensitizing to moon missions. The same could be said of the ocean leviathans of the early 20th century. It is equally important to remember that the Titanic, or any of the Olympic-class vessels, were not designed to be record-breaking liners. The White Star Line knew they would not be able to compete with Cunard in this regard, and instead were keen to combat their rivals in opulence. Punctuality remained of utmost significance within the shipping industry, but an early arrival would do little for passengers who had plans to continue their journey onwards. For instance, those who had booked trains from New York on Wednesday would have been left high and dry for a Tuesday evening arrival. It must be said, however, that according to On a Sea of Glass, the potential of a Tuesday night arrival was well known to many passengers and crew at the time of the ship's departure. Nevertheless, this does not present evidence of culpability, merely that such an eventuality was possible, but not guaranteed. It was common practice for ships of such size to make headway in good conditions in the North Atlantic, to make up for any lost time as a result of delays during departure or arrival. The following quote, in reference to Cunard's Lusitania, when she had obtained the blue riband during her record journey in October 1907, provides perspective when the Titanic and the notion of speed are juxtaposed. Neither the equipment nor the route excelled those of the Titanic, only the latter's luck was worse. Furthermore, reducing speed within the vicinity of ice was considered an uncommon practice at the time, as many surviving Titanic officers would attest to during the inquiries. However, it is the testimony of Captain Rostron of the RMS Carpathia which came to Titanic's aid that is arguably most significant in providing suitable context, and his considered opinion regarding transatlantic crossings. Senator Smith: do you regard the route he, Captain Smith, was taking as entirely practical and appropriate at this time of the year? Captain Rostron: quite so. This is most exceptional. At the British inquiry, Rostron was pressed further on the issue of speed in relation to iceberg warnings. The Commissioner: supposing you had had a report of the character that I have indicated to you of icebergs and an ice field in the regions which you are bound to cross, when you approach that region, would you take any precautions with regard to the safety of your vessel? Captain Rostron: well, a great deal would depend on the weather and the atmospheric conditions. The Commissioner: suppose it is perfectly clear. Captain Rostron: if it is a perfectly clear night, and I was sure of my position and everything else, unless I knew there was a lot of ice about, I should feel perfectly justified in going full speed. Captain Smith was under no obligation to, nor was he undermined by, Ismay in any way, or at the very least there is no evidence to suggest this was the case. He knew perfectly well the risks and did nothing out of the ordinary that any other experienced commander would have done. The lookouts were informed of the ice warnings, the officers on watch were to reduce speed in the event of any deterioration of conditions, and it is argued that Smith never fully retired that evening, so as to be on hand in the event of any potential predicament. Ismay meanwhile spent the day and evening hobnobbing with the great and powerful, oblivious to any orders Smith had or had not made on the bridge. Certainly these are not the actions of a Machiavellian villain. Legend has it that Ismay and Lord William Pirrie, managing director of Holland and Wolff, sat down for dinner sometime in 1907 and dreamed up the mighty sisters Olympic and Titanic, vessels to triumph over and rival the brand new Cunard liners, the Lusitania and Mauretania. It seems fanciful to suggest, however, that Ismay and the White Star Line waited until the very moment the two new Cunarders were launched to conceive of their plan for transatlantic dominance. It is also superfluous to bestow fabled origins to the two liners, which without tragedy would have been as memorable today as any other full-funnel ship, that is, to maritime enthusiasts and historians. It is not necessary to bathe the birth of the ship in such a sepia glow. There was nothing particularly inspired or outlandish in the idea of building a bigger ship than the one before. Just as Titanic's genesis is enveloped in mythology, so of course is its death. A prevailing discourse, which has arguably found some footing in recent decades, is that the Titanic was hastily constructed in a fashion akin to a Potemkin vessel. Shoddy methods and dubious means are obvious candidates to interpret the kismet and melodrama of the Titanic. There is of course little credence to these claims, and they are worth little attention. However, it would be remiss to avoid mentioning it at all. I am no metallurgist, but the standard of steel used in the construction of the Titanic has been called into question due to its high sulfur and phosphorus content, impurities, and high volume of sulfides and silicates. In addition, the use of wrought iron rivets containing high levels of slag made them prone to failure under impact and a tendency to pop during collisions. However, it has equally been noted that the Titanic used steel which was probably as good as was available at the time the ship was constructed, despite its inferiority in comparison to modern steel. To counter this assertion, we need look no further than the Olympic class design itself, which had already proved its durability and quality via two separate events even before Titanic's main voyage. The first of which was RMS Olympic's collision with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke in September 1911, which resulted in substantial damage to both ships. However, the Olympic remained afloat despite the flooding of two of her watertight compartments. Subsequently, in January 1912, the Olympic encountered a ferocious Atlantic storm, which Captain Smith, who was the commander of the vessel at the time, claimed as the worst he had ever encountered. Despite some slight superficial damage, the ship itself was unharmed, which only reinforced the belief in both the Olympic and Titanic's design. It is no surprise that the Olympic would be bestowed the sobriquet Old Reliable after a lifespan lasting some 25 years. Wouldn't it seem strange to consider that the designers and builders of both liners chose to underdevelop only one of the sisters at the expense of the other? The cost and expense of both Olympic-class liners, in addition to the reputation and profitability of both White Star and Holland and Wolff, would indeed be under scrutiny if they were found to have used materials or techniques lacking in quality in comparison to other liners and shipbuilders of the era. It is impossible to overlook the fact that the Board of Trade, who would need to sign off on the seaworthiness of all British ships, would be stringent in their assessment of any design defects or flaws, and anything but the best possible manufacturing would only serve to create expensive retrofits and bad publicity, which would tarnish or even destroy the reputation of the White Star Line and Holland and Wolff. Everyone from both White Star and Holland and Wolff knew at the project's outset that each of these new ships would be examined down to the minutest detail by Board of Trade surveyors. Those surveyors would visit the ships literally hundreds of times during construction. Long before the first rivet was even driven, the board had to approve every plan for the liner's design. Consequently, the Titanic passed her trials with flying colours, and the Board of Trade surveyors were thoroughly pleased with her performance. Ismay, as ever with the drivel which often accompanies the Titanic, is unable to escape the crosshairs of those who blame him for the catastrophe. As White Star chairman, he of course was in a position of authority to undercut the costs of materials and construction, or so the theory goes. Yet any potential cost savings due to poorer steel or a lack of lifeboat provision would be minuscule in comparison to the great expenses associated with building the giant liners. Any shipping business, be it the construction firm Holland and Wolff or the White Star Line, would have little to gain from the risk of any form of corner cutting. Shipping companies would merely look for alternative builders if they believed their manufacturing quality was poor, and passengers would find alternate means to travel through Cunard or other lines if any defects or issues were exposed. Why would Ismay have risked being exposed in a scandal over such a small percentage of the overall expense, if indeed he even had the clout to have attempted to do so? If Ismay had somehow somehow concocted a method to penny pinch without the knowledge or express agreement of Harland and Wolff, would he himself have risked the journey on its maiden voyage, knowing full well the risks a transatlantic crossing poses to even the most robust of ships? In any case, Ismay had little involvement in the actual construction of the Two Sisters and was far more content burying himself in the intricate details of the ship's proposed amenities and comforts. The facts are, the Titanic survived for the best part of 3 hours despite the fatal wound she suffered, a collision no one had foreseen. She did well to stay afloat for that long, and her design and construction helped save lives, whilst another ship, for instance the Lusitania, may have foundered far quicker. Frankly, even Ismay's biggest critic would best avoid this subject, as it fails to stand up to the remotest scrutiny. If there is one abiding image of Bruce Ismay and the Titanic, then arguably it is his controversial escape from the foundering ship, as hundreds of others were left behind to the mercy of the Atlantic waters. The following quote succinctly describes the issue at hand. In an era of chivalry, when one of the worst insults that could be hurled at a man was to call his behaviour ungentlemanly, how could surviving men justify climbing into a lifeboat when women and children were left behind on the ship? Sometime around 12:30 AM, Captain Smith had conferred with ship designer Thomas Andrews about the condition of the stricken liner, and as soon as her fate was made clear, Smith gave the order to abandon ship by directing officers to receive women and children into the lifeboats. Officers and deck crew worked rapidly over the next 90 minutes to load and lower 16 of the 20 lifeboats available until only the emergency collapsible boats remained. Collapsible C was the last boat to be lowered from the starboard side at about 2 AM, just 20 minutes before the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface. This was the lifeboat that Ismay would ultimately abscond upon. To some, the fact Ismay survived is reason enough to brand him a coward. However, it's important to set the scene before any accusations can be made one way or another, particularly in reference to whether he boarded the lifeboat at the expense of others. There is no record of Ismay being refused entry to the lifeboat, or no woman, child or any other passenger being turned away as a result of him having boarded. Ismay himself remained adamant that when he entered Lifeboat C, there were no other passengers within the vicinity of the boat deck. The following statement from Ismay in the immediate aftermath of the disaster attempted to paint a picture of the scenario he faced. At that time, every wooden lifeboat on the starboard side had been lowered away, and I found that they were engaged in getting out this forward collapsible boat on the starboard side. I assisted in this work, and all the women that were on this deck were helped into the boat. As the boat was going over the side, Mr. Carter, a passenger, and myself got in. At that time, there was not a woman on the boat deck, nor any passengers of any class, as far as we could see or hear. Mr. Carter and I did not get into the boat until after they had begun to lower it away. William Carter, the passenger which Ismay alluded to, would corroborate this account. The statements which have been made by many persons regarding Mr. Ismay's conduct are an injustice to him. Mr. Ismay and myself and several of the officers walked up and down the deck crying, "Are there any more women here?" We called for several minutes and got no answer. One of the officers then declared that if we wished to, we could get into the boat if we took the place of seamen. Mr. Ismay called again, and after we got no reply, we got into the lifeboat. I desired to correct what has been said about him. He was perfectly cool and collected, and aided a great deal in keeping the women from the steerage quiet. Ismay would persist in the assertion that neither Mr. Carter nor myself would for one moment have thought of getting into the boat if there had been any women there to go in it. First Officer Murdoch, who was tasked with lowering Collapsible C, was not as stringent as Second Officer Lightoller during his duties on the port side of the ship in regards to Captain Smith's order to put the women and children in and lower away. Murdoch seemingly interpreted this order as women and children were to be admitted first, and then in the absence of any such passengers, then men were welcome to board the boats. Indeed, Collapsible C included a number of male passengers alongside Ismay who were not members of the crew. There are those witnesses who agree with Ismay and Carter's recollections. First class passenger Archibald Gracie would write that he saw no disorder around the lowering of Collapsible C, and that no one had ordered Ismay in, and that there was no one else on deck. Gracie would survive by clinging onto the upturned Collapsible B, which was washed off the Titanic only minutes later, and as such he could verifiably have witnessed the events. However, it does beg the question, if Gracie witnessed the lowering of Collapsible C, then why didn't he himself enter it? Quartermaster Rowe would be the leading crew member in Collapsible C and testified to the following. When Chief Officer Wilde asked if there was any more women and children, there was no reply, so Mr. Ismay came aboard the boat. Rowe was then asked if he could see any women and children, and he answered that he could not see the deck from his position within the lifeboat, but none were forthcoming. It seems counterintuitive that there were no passengers within earshot when the only remaining lifeboats were those collapsible boats at the forefront of the boat deck. Over 1,500 people were still on board, so why would they they not be desperately attempting to make their way into the last opportunity for safety and sanctuary? Perhaps one explanation is that many were retreating from the rising water level which, at this time, had already flooded the forward well deck and forecastle. Instinctively, it would seem logical to move aft the driest section of the ship away from immediate danger. In addition, the developing chaos of the night would have created confusion for passengers who were either unaware of which lifeboats had already been launched, or indeed where the lifeboats were originally situated. This is further exacerbated by the division of class on deck, in particular to the lifeboat in question at the time of its lowering. About 80 first-class passengers had left in boats 1, 3, 5 and 7 on the forward part of the boat deck, virtually emptying the promenade deck of passengers. Second and third-class passengers had no access to this part of the ship, and subsequently the boats mentioned contained only first-class passengers and crew. This is indeed an important distinction. Collapsible C was located on the officers' promenade, next to the first-class section of the boat deck. Such a place would have been out of bounds and unknown to the vast majority of those on board. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that Ismay's account is near to the truth. However, there are also a number of survivors who contest the circumstances of the immediate surroundings. Specifically, there are those who refer to women passengers being forcefully pushed into the boat, officers sounding warning shots to warn male passengers away, the physical removal of men already in the lifeboat, and seamen forming a human barrier to ensure admittance to only women and children. Third-class passenger Joseph Hyman would recall that the forward deck was jammed with people, all of them pushing and clawing and fighting. Jack Thayer would partly agree with this assessment. There was some disturbance in loading the last two forward starboard boats. A large crowd of men was pressing to get into them. No women were around as far as I could see. I saw Ismay, who had been assisting in the loading of the last boat, push his way into it. It was really every man for himself. If therefore other passengers were present, then is there an alternative explanation for Ismay's departure? Curiously enough, there are a number of testimonies which suggest that Ismay had little choice but to depart the stricken liner and was physically, or at least verbally, ordered to do so. Second Officer Lightoller would refer to the loading and lowering of Lifeboat C in the US inquiry. It is that Chief Officer Wilde was at the starboard collapsible boat in which Mr. Ismay went away, and that he told Mr. Ismay there are no more women on board the ship. Wilde was a pretty big, powerful chap, and he was a man that would not argue very long, and Mr. Wilde simply bundled him into the boat. Lightoller, however, was tasked with lowering lifeboats on the port side of the vessel, and at this time was busy loading collapsible D. How then could he have witnessed this? First-class passenger Georgette Madrill asserted that she saw Ismay get in the last boat, which was then but half filled, and that he did so at the solicitation of Captain Smith. Yet Madrill likely left the Titanic 20 minutes prior to Ismay. The theme of an order being issued to Ismay was, however, also supported by the ship's barber Augustus Weichmann, who agreed that no women were within the immediate section of the boat deck. This boat was the last to leave, to the best of my knowledge. He was ordered into the boat by the officer in charge. I think that Mr. Ismay was justified in getting in the boat at that time. Alternatively, first-class passenger Thomas Cardeza was quoted in stating that it was not a figure of authority which determined Ismay's decision. "No, I will remain here and not take the place of a woman," Mr. Cardeza quoted Mr. Ismay as saying. The women urged him, however, he said, and some of the men joined in, requesting him to get into the boat. Mr. Ismay, said Mr. Cardeza, finally consented and got in. Ismay, however, remained adamant that he himself made the decision to leave, under no direction from anyone else. In any case, Cardeza claimed that this event occurred in Lifeboat 3, which had left over an hour previous to when Ismay was generally regarded to have departed. This confusion is only intensified by alternative accounts of which lifeboat Ismay took. Fireman Harry Sr. claimed, for instance, that he saw the first boat lowered, 13 people were on board, 11 men and 2 women. 3 were millionaires and 1 was Ismay. Senator Isidore Rayner would discount the claim that Ismay took one of the last lifeboats, and in a damning indictment would brandish him a coward for taking any lifeboat and criminally responsible for the sinking. In response, Senator Porter McCumber came to Ismay's defence in the Senate. "Yesterday, Mr. President, one of the survivors of that terrible calamity, upon a rather flimsy and uncertain report, in my opinion, was tried, convicted, sentenced and executed in the Senate of the United States. I desire to register my protest against the trial of anyone connected with the operation of that ship, from the highest officer of the company to the seamen who sailed thereon, without fair, honest and full hearing." However, perhaps the most scathing attack would come from Clement Edwards MP, who questioned Ismay during the British inquiry. When Mr. Edwards was asked by the Commissioner if he believed that Ismay should have gone down with the ship, he responded that as White Star Chairman, he was in effect an auxiliary member of the crew and responsible for the safety of the passengers. Frankly, that is so. I do not flinch from it a little bit, but I want to get it from this witness, inasmuch as he took upon himself to give certain directions at a certain time, why he did not discharge the responsibility even after that, having regard to other persons or passengers. Ismay did his best to deflect and defend from this. There were no more passengers to get into that boat. the boat was actually being lowered away. The Commissioner, Lord Mersey, would criticise this line of questioning in his final report and finished by declaring, had he, Ismay, not jumped in, he would merely have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of those lost. We will never truly know what went through his mind in the seconds it took for him to step off the boat deck and over the precipice of the gunwale. Whatever the circumstances around the lowering of the lifeboat in question, at the purported time of its launch, the Titanic was very much in her last moments of stability. It was a desperate situation for anyone. Most lifeboats had now departed. The boat deck was awash and the ship beginning to list. Ismay was no sailor and had no clearly defined responsibility to remain on board, but within those moments he knew that death was quickly approaching. The water level would soon wash over the bridge and the angle of trim was steadily increasing. It's the image of nightmares. As a result of this action, however, his legacy would be open season for every pressman and politician, yet perhaps even that would pale relative to the torment he suffered. One newspaper would be categorical in their assessment of the ghosts he had left behind whilst he lived out his days within semi-exile in Ireland. Day after day he must hear them, the shrieks of drowning men crying down the wind. In her biography of Ismay, How to Survive the Titanic, The Sinking of J. Bruce Ismay, Francis Wilson recalls an incident which took place during his youth. Ismay's father disliked his son and saw him as spoiled, and their relationship was strained at best. He wanted his character, the eldest son, to be his mirror image, but not to occupy the same space. Thomas provided him with palatial homes, fleets of servants, and an upper-class education, but then resented him for having it easy. Bruce grew up knowing that he was not himself, but a failed version of someone else. He was never to forget that he was an inferior model, an imperfect copy. Bruce Ismay, however, was the only one of Thomas's three sons who immersed himself in the maritime trade of his father, and thus his career in the White Star Line was put in motion. One day, he had purloined his father's horse, which he was forbidden to do so, and took it for a ride along the Mersey coast. The animal, however, met with an incident and was injured, which led to it being euthanized. Ismay's father was so apoplectic that the junior Ismay never rode again. This pattern was to be repeated throughout his life, states Wilson. When his oldest son died as a baby, Ismay found contact with his next three children difficult. When his second son Tom caught polio, he further distanced himself. When the Titanic was sinking, Ismay could not watch, and he then never went to New York again. During his younger years, whilst he was manager of the New York agency for the White Star Line, Ismay became acquainted with the rising press baron, William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, perhaps best known for the thinly veiled depiction of his life in Orson Welles' 1941 classic Citizen Kane, was a reformist who saw himself as a spokesman for the American people. He called his work government by newspaper. From the outset, Hearst disliked Ismay, who he saw as the epitome of reserved, supercilious Britishness. His haughty personality, indicative of Edwardian hubris, were character traits which made for an easy mark, but his subsequent actions did little to assail the critics. Ismay loathed publicity and had never mastered the art of public speaking or self-presentation. He had a brusque, abrupt and imperious manner, and journalists, to whom he was always rude, saw him as arrogant, charmless and disdainful. As soon as Titanic's catastrophic death toll had reached America and Ismay was declared a survivor, a narrative had quickly developed. Having survived at the expense of others, notably including some women and children, there was reason enough for outrage towards this Englishman, but his subsequent clandestine attempts to repatriate himself and the surviving crew as soon as possible, and a perceived initial reluctance to welcome the hastily arranged inquiry, did him little favours. Hearst's New York American newspaper led the attack, brandishing him as J. Brute Ismay, and suggesting the White Star Line be renamed to Yellow Liver. Whilst the onslaught unfolded, Ismay was alone on the rescue ship Carpathia, sat trembling in the surgeon's cabin shot full of opiates. His physical isolation would soon transition beyond to a more generalised seclusion on both sides of the Atlantic. America was no place for him. To a country of self-made men, he was a spoilt product of the class system. However, as Wilson continues, Britain had never truly warmed to him either. He was despised in Britain, on the other hand, for his lack of pedigree, for assuming the privileges of an aristocrat while working in trade for a living. For a country whose hierarchy is based on birth, Ismay was no more than a Liverpudlian businessman. Seamen thought him a shore dweller. To his family, who feared him, he was king of an ocean world. Ismay's problem, as the British inquiry concluded, was that he belonged in a category of his own. Nevertheless, the barracking he received within the Senate and on the front pages would rally elements of British society to his cause. Upon his return to Liverpool, he was received with loud cheers at the harbour. He thus became a proxy figure in the cooling of Anglo-American relations and the fallout of the disaster. Even the town of Ismay in rural Montana allegedly debated changing its name to distance itself from its namesake. The fantastic historical fiction novel The Midnight Watch may embellish this feud, but it provides a sense of the collective sentiment. This is not good for us, John. Not good. All those American millionaires, Morgan's friends, all dead. You know Senator Smith down in Washington? He's already turning this into America versus Britain. It's the Tea Party all over again. Amongst all the sensationalism and outrage, however, there was little attention to understanding Ismay's disposition. Ismay was described by those under him as dogmatic and dictatorial. He would brook no argument, and his insistence on punctuality verged on the fanatical. Ismay, however, was also known to show compassion. He was well aware of the tragic circumstances surrounding the Ryersons who had lost their eldest son before their journey on the Titanic. He had offered them an extra stateroom and inquired after their comfort and well-being during the journey. His manner, though, often came across as quite reserved and distant to those he did not know, and also awkward and overexcitable. Foibles and eccentricities are not, however, substantive evidence to suggest that his character was untrustworthy or conniving. Yet again, it suggests that the legend of the sinking has led to a narrative allowing for assumptions which attempt to easily explain tragic circumstances. Ismay's decision to leave the Titanic may be in question, but his actions during the sinking are not in doubt. Walter Lord provides numerous examples of eyewitness testimony in his celebrated book about the sinking, A Night to Remember. On the starboard side, things moved a little faster, but not fast enough for President Ismay, who dashed to and fro, urging the men to hurry. There's no time to lose, he urged Third Officer Pitman, who was working on Boat 5. Pitman shrugged him off. He didn't know Ismay, and he had no time for an officious stranger in carpet slippers. Ismay told him to load the boat with women and children. This was too much for Pitman. I await the commander's orders, he announced. Pitman was the only officer to have encountered Ismay during the sinking. As number 5 creaked downward, Bruce Ismay was beside himself. Lower away, he chanted, waving one arm in huge circles while hanging onto the davit with the other. If you'll get the hell out of the way, exploded 5th Officer Lowe, who was working the davits, I'll be able to do something. You want me to lower away quickly? You'll have me drown the whole lot of them. Ismay was completely abashed. Without a word, he turned and walked forward to number 3. Eventually, however, as the night wore on, he was seemingly acknowledged as a member of the crew, despite his official designation as a voluntary passenger and the constant badgering of Titanic's officers. The ship's barber, Weichman, who quickly came to his aid in the month after the disaster, provided a contrast to the overwhelming negative press he had received. There was no finer man on the boat than Ismay. He is a brick, a white man, and did not get a square deal in the papers. He was in one of the last boats to be lowered because I was right there helping to get them overboard. His spirit, though, seemingly broke when he entered Collapsible Sea and assisted in its rowing away from the ship he had christened. In Collapsible Sea, President Bruce Ismay bent low over his oar. He couldn't bear to see her go down. Francis Wilson does provide an alternate view regarding Ismay's adrenaline-induced, nerve-wracked heroism, however, which brings into question his thought process in those early morning hours. Ismay was the only man, apart from the captain, the ship's designer, and the chief engineer, who knew that the ship would be at the bottom of the sea within 2 hours, and that the available lifeboats could carry less than half of those on board. But he did not warn or even try to find Dr. O'Loughlin, who had been his dining companion that evening, or Charles Hayes, who was travelling as his guest, or Richard Fry, his valet of 10 years, or George Dodd, his family's former butler, now working as a steward in first class, or Arthur Hayter, who had been his steward throughout the journey, or William Harrison, his secretary, all of whom were to deny. When Ismay and the other survivors of Collapsible Sea reached the Carpathia at dawn on the 15th, he was certainly suffering from the onset of hypothermia, as he had not had the opportunity to change from his pyjamas and only had a coat as protection from the elements. During the onward journey to New York, Ismay locked himself away, lamenting the fact he had survived, declaring to those that would listen that he should have gone down with the ship. First-class passenger and survivor Jack Thayer, who was well acquainted with Ismay, was asked to call in on him during this time. He would note that, I'm almost certain that on the Titanic his hair had been black with slight tinges of grey, but now his hair was virtually snow white. I have never seen a man so completely wrecked. Nothing I could do or say brought any response. Arguably, this was the beginning of his supposed reclusiveness as he shielded himself from the world outside. There is some debate regarding this, however, as, on A Sea of Glass notes, although he withdrew from certain social circles and was semi-retired, he continued to remain active in his business interests. The following passage, however, at least surmises the partition of his life and career as soon as he set foot on the Cunard ship which had rescued him and lived the rest of his life in an exile of his own choosing. Ismay stumbled aboard the Carpathia around 6:30, mumbling, I'm Ismay. Trembling, he stood near the gangway, his back against a bulkhead. Dr. McGee gently approached him. Will you not go into the saloon and get some soup or something to drink? No, I really don't want anything at all. Do go and get something. If you will leave me alone, I'll be much happier here, Ismay blurted, then changed his mind. If you can get me in some room where I can be quiet, I wish you would. Please, the doctor softly persisted. Go to the saloon and get something hot. I would rather not. Dr. McGee gave up. He gently led Ismay to his own cabin. It was the start of a self-imposed exile from active life. Within a year he retired from the White Star Line, purchased a large estate on the west coast of Ireland, and remained a virtual recluse till he died in 1937. Ismay had lost his faith in both science and religion. The Titanic had sunk beneath him, but God had not saved him. Even when he tried to hide away from prying eyes, pressmen continued to hound him for years afterwards, reporting, in one of the wildest spots on the west coast of Ireland, where the silence is so heavy that one hardly dares to speak, lives in exile a man who until a few years ago had a high social standing in New York, had wealth and enjoyed all the pleasures and sports that his rank and financial standing afforded. Now it was reported local children chanted, "Coward, coward, coward," when they passed his gate. Ismay and Yamsey, the English gentleman and the northern upstart, the visionary and the capitalist, the voluntary passenger and the super captain, the survivor and the coward.